Hello everybody. Today we are fortunate enough to have with us Richard Vigne, who is the CEO of the old Pejeta Conservancy. And today we're going to talk to him a little bit about the link we have with the Conservancy. So Richard, how long have you been living in Kenya?
I've lived here all my life.
Really?
So I was born and brought up in
You
Kenya,
were born and brought up here? Wow. And your parents?
I come from a family that specializes in being either in the military or growing tea.
Oh, okay.
My father was in the military and grew tea, and they lived in India and latterly Ceylon, as it was then known. And then my father came to Kenya in 1948, I can't remember exactly, and worked for a company in Western Kenya called Brook Bonds Limited, which is a famous tea company in Britain anyway.
Oh yes, it is. Yes, I know it.
And he grew and manufactured tea for close on 40 years.
Huh.
So that's where I was born and brought up. Yeah.
Okay, and so did you attend school here? Did you study
I did,
here?
up until the age of 10.
Okay.
I was at school here, and then I went to boarding school in the UK, much to my mother's upset. and then, yeah, I went to university in the UK.
And then you came back
I worked in Uganda for 5 years, in the safari industry there, Uganda and Zaire. And then I went and did an MSc in the UK and came back here. And
so were you happy to come back?
Yeah. No, I wouldn't want to live anywhere else.
And why is that?
It's home. That's where I like to stay.
Tell me about what's home.
There's also a massive amount of opportunity in Kenya because it's a developing country, and notwithstanding all of the various different problems it's been through over the past 20 years, the bottom line is there's still huge opportunities here for people who are prepared to take the risk. And I find that exciting.
Yeah, of course. Oh, that's great. Conservancy. So Richard, I'm interested in knowing how does PKSS help with the Conservancy here?
Okay, so we've had a relationship with PKSS for 7 years now, and what I think is fascinating about the relationship is it's a reflection of the way that conservation is beginning to happen, not only in Kenya but across the world, whereby the role of people in conservation is becoming much more widely acknowledged. So in Old Pejeta's model for conservation, basically we aim to achieve conservation at the same time as providing tangible social benefit to people living around us who are impacted by our conservation activities. And what PKSS does in our relationship with them is allow that social benefit to be created through your efforts to get involved in the educational facilities and the provision of education amongst the local people who live around Old Pejeta and Old Pejeta's conservation activity. So it's a relationship which kind of cements people's, if I can put it like this, as people's approval for conservation, which is going to be absolutely essential to enable conservation to happen into the long-term future.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the local people then, because they're being supported, feel more likely to support the Conservancy as well. Can you give me a direct example of that? So, for example, PKS is involved in, providing cows for schools and desks and chairs and things like that. How is that directly related to the animals here at the Conservancy?
Okay. Conservation of wildlife, particularly in a place like Africa, requires space. It requires the creation of habitat within which those animals can exist. Now, in order for that to happen, we as Old Pejeta are operating across an area of around about 360 square kilometers. And we're surrounded on all sides by people who are living on much smaller patches of land, and who are often impacted by, or have in the past anyway, been impacted by the wildlife that lives on Old Pejeta. So in order...
it's impacted in what way?
Well, for example, if elephants break out through our fences, across our southern boundaries to go into small-scale farming areas to eat crops belonging to farmers, that's a direct impact, a negative impact that wildlife is having on people, on the locals. So that's something that we need to address, and clearly the first way of addressing that is by preventing the elephants from going across those fences in the first place. But also we essentially we need we need people living around us to be supportive of us. If people weren't supportive of us, politically speaking, it would be difficult for us to justify owning and occupying this amount of land in a country like Kenya, which is where the population is increasing all of the time and where demand for land continues to increase. And not only do we have to have their support from that perspective, but we need, in order for them to value what conservation can offer from an environmental perspective, they need to see tangible benefit from it. In other words, if we simply erected a fence and isolated ourselves from the people living around us, and they saw no benefit from us, it would be perfectly possible for feelings of jealousy to begin to develop, that we're the rich people on the one hand, whilst they're the poor people on the other side of the fence. And really what conservation requires is a much closer relationship across different land holdings, including small-scale land holdings, to enable, in a kind of holistic sense, conservation across the greater landscape to take place. So it's about people accepting, A, that conservation can happen, and B, that they have a direct role to play in supporting the opportunity for conservation to happen. And in order for that to happen, people have to see some benefit from it. And so this helps us to provide benefit to people.
Okay, so the people that live around the boundaries of Pejeta see a direct benefit by what PKS does to help them in their community and their education. Okay, so what about some success stories in terms of the animals here over the last, say, I don't know, 15, 20 years, or even the last 7 or 8 since PKS has been involved? Have there been benefits to the animals, and if so, what?
You know, we're the biggest black rhino sanctuary in East Africa. The black rhino is a heavily threatened species, particularly over the last couple of years, where demand for rhino horn in Far Eastern countries, particularly Vietnam, has risen dramatically, meaning that the incentives from a financial perspective now provided to local poachers to kill rhinos have increased hugely over the last couple of years.
How much would a poacher get for a rhino horn?
Right now, the price payable to the guy who kills the rhino is about $1 million shillings.
And what does that translate to?
$1 million shillings translates to around about 13,000 to 14,000 Canadian dollars.
Wow.
Which is equivalent to very approximately 7 years worth of earnings for the average formally employed person in Kenya.
Wow,
so it's a significant amount of money.
Yes,
so the incentive for people to take risks to come to places like Pejeta to kill rhinos is very high.
So what stops them from coming and killing the rhinos?
I'm going to come on to that.
Okay.
Part of our approach, obviously, is to secure our Pejeta and to secure our rhino population, and we do that by having an elaborate security system. But probably the most important part of the security system that we operate here is based on an informer network that sits within the local community.
So the locals inform.
So it's the locals who are informing us about people wishing to come into the area to kill rhinos.
Okay.
And without that informer network, and without the support that we get from the local people living around us, because they value our presence because of what we are doing for them, then we wouldn't be able to stop it.
You wouldn't.
So you can have as many armed people running around the place as you like, but to secure 360 square kilometers of land requires a whole lot more than armed people. It requires support and information from the people living around us, and that's the most effective way of stopping poaching. So there's a pretty good example.
That's great news. Now, do you actually go out and talk to the locals yourself, and they give you this information? I mean, or do they come to you? How does that work?
It works in a variety of different ways, but you know, I will occasionally get phone calls from people who we have worked with in our community development program saying this particular individual is in the area. We know that he's a known poacher. We want you to be aware. Simple telephone calls like that. So we'll get information on a continuous basis.
Oh, that's great.
From local people. Yeah.
Now, okay, so let's look at the future. How do you see PKS's involvement in the future? What as we move ahead, what would you like to see happen?
Well, I think there are two major aspects. I mean, if you look at the sort of demographics of Kenya, the biggest impediment to this country is the lack of formally educated people. Now we're Kenya is actually pretty good compared to most other countries in Africa. In other words, the levels of education are actually comparatively high.
Yeah,
they're increasing. And as a ticket, as a route to the development of this country, which will ultimately result in people not having to rely on semi-arid land to make their livings, which will enable people to gain formal job opportunity, etc., etc., and ultimately allow the economy to develop and grow for the benefit of everybody that lives in the country. Formal education is going to be the most important thing that we can do, and that's the principal reason that Old Pejeta has what has become a fairly large education program, which PKSS is the major contributor to. And my first answer to your question is that what we need to see is we need to see our combined inputs to the education sector in this area, which is a fairly impoverished area.
Yes, it is.
Growing dramatically.
Right.
That's what we'd like to see.
Okay.
Because ultimately that's everybody's ticket for a better life.
Absolutely.
And it's also the ticket for environmental protection.
Yes.
Ultimately.
And raising environmental awareness and
also just
protection.
the fact that people don't have to be reliant on land and can have a job in Nairobi, meaning that they're not having to carve up wildlife habitat to try to make it
Without a
exist.
living. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what quite excites me about PKSS is the fact that there is an opportunity here for kids living relatively privileged lives in the West to interact with kids in Kenya who are much less privileged, who have none of the sort of none of the wealth or facilities or any of the kind of benefits that are considered normal in the Western
world, right?
And to open their eyes that actually they need if the planet as a whole, from both the social and environmental perspective, is going to thrive going forwards, then issues of poor kids in Africa not receiving the education that every child deserves is something that they, as they grow up again, have to begin to address. So it's the development, the opportunity to help develop a social conscience in young people in the West.
Right.
I think really excites me. And I think it's something that we need to do more of, and I think it's one of the great benefits that PKSS brings to the whole educational program that Old Pejeta is trying to run.
And I've got to say too that it's the same for the Canadian or the students that are supported or that support PKSS, because they learn a lot from connecting with the students in Kenya. A lot of things that the students in Kenya do, Canadian students do not do, and so there's a real possibility of learning from Kenyan students as well, right?
I'm sure it can work both ways, and I'm sure.
And that's great.
That's a great thing.
It really is.
And so, what you're saying is for the Kenyan kids to understand that there is a world beyond Kenya, and to give them, something to aspire to. There's nothing nowadays. People are mobile.
That's right.
Large numbers of Kenyans live abroad and live in what they call the diaspora. And these kids should be, if they want to, able to aspire to go and live and work in the Western world. If by exposure at an early age,
right,
that's something that they can begin to aspire to, that's a good thing.
And also, too, I think that they see that they are valued by the West as well, that they have value to give. So thanks very much, Richard, for taking the time out today to talk to us, and we really, really value our relationship, and we look forward to this continuation in the future.
I'm sure it will, and thank you for all the work that PKSS does. It's massively important, and it's having a dramatic impact.
Thank you.
Well, rest assured our relationship will continue.
Super. Thanks.